So like we've got some sub-collections. What I'd really like to do is look at using Firebase, the context API, to create one of those higher order components like that with router. Because that's another pattern to hook into Firebase that we might really like in our React application. And this one's not going to be too bad because we're going to cheat. And we're going to leverage the work that we already did with the user context provider before. So a higher order component is effectively a component that returns another component, right? Based off of like higher order functions, because React's all about the functional programming, right? So basically, it's a component. You give it one, it wraps it in a new component that passes more props in. And through the magic of JavaScript and closures, everything just kind of works. All right, so let's go ahead. We're going to make a new component called with user. Right, and with user, we're going to bring in React, and we're going to bring in that user context. Like, we could write all of the code that we wrote before in that user context, where we were subscribing to everything, so on and so forth, but we already wrote it. Like, I don't want to write that code again. I didn't like it last time I wrote it. I have it written once, and I'm not doing it again. So we'll make a new component called with user, and it will take a component as an argument, which is like feels weird, but look at that with router. With router took our post page component and returned a new component that passed in all the React router stuff. So we're going to basically implement that pattern so it's no longer black magic to us, and we can figure out how to hook into Firebase with it. So we're going to make a new one called wrapped component. And that wrap component is going to take some props, and it's going to return whatever component we passed in, pass in the user, and then like whatever other components, like whatever other props it takes. Right? Whatever other props you passed in, those props, but also the user. Curly braces are fun. Not going to let curly braces bite me twice here. Famous last words. Cool. And then we just return that wrapped component. Again, if this looks gnarly, just remember, it takes a component and it returns a component that takes some props. Whatever those props that got passed in, it adds user onto those and then gives you back that component. I'm going to do one other thing just for debugging happiness because I feel the need to be responsible, which is Babel will go ahead and use the name of a constant or the name of the class to give your components a display name so that when you look at them in the React tools, you see like, oh, the name of the component. Otherwise, if you ever saw like just underscore class, that's what they're called otherwise. And so like most of the components that you write normally get names at compile time, or like the build process puts in the part that gives them names. In this case, we're like dynamically generating a component. So we're real quick going to just give ourselves this function get, I guess I do const, get display name. That's going to take in a wrapped component. And what it's going to do is going to look at the name. This is going to get the name of a component. And so we can basically take the name of that component and name this component that, and we'll call it like with user. So this will just, there's unfortunately like over time there's a bunch of different ways that it could have a component name. So it's either got a display name or a name, or if all else fails, just call it component. And then what we'll do is we'll say that this new wrapped component display name with user, and then whatever was named previously. This is totally optional, but let me just tell you right now, if you don't do this, eventually when you go to debug your code like 2 months from now, nothing will make any sense and everything will just have no name and you'll be really sad. So this is what Redux does when you do connect. This happens to you out of the box. Really, we're just dispelling myths right now. All right. So I've got with user. Now with post page, we can bring in with user. There it is, and we'll just wrap that as well. So I'll say with. And there are helper methods like compose that make this a little bit better. So that you can just say compose, give it a series of functions, and then the component. And that just runs it through all of them. It's the same as this, but it looks prettier. So we'll say with user. And now we should have, we'll console log the props first. When this component mounts. And look at that. Along with match and all that other stuff, look what we got. We got the user, right, passed into that component as well. So this is a way so that you don't have to pass everything down through your application. You basically hook up into Firebase with the common things that you need. You can pass them to components as you need them. So now what we can do is we can basically say const user equals this dot props. We'll put the user in there. All right, let's try it out. You see we've got the username passed in. Right? So just, again, some interesting state management tools so that you're not like at the whim of just like kind of at every component mount hooking into everything, right? Because especially with the provider, there's a thing that like we kind of didn't talk about that the provider is really good at, which is we're making that first query once. So if many components are using that provider, that's the same query being fed to all of them. It's not like you have 10 components that need the user that are all asking, hey, user slash whatever the UID is, right? Because those will each count as a query. This is one query done by the provider passed to every component that needs it, right? And since we're subscribing, like that means every time the user changes, which is probably not that often, it's still one query rather than every component asking for it. So being clever with state management can also save you money,